Before there was Mary, before there was Sophia, before any mother goddess was carved into stone or recited in chant, there was Isis. Not just the queen of Egypt, not just a deity of fertility or magic, but something far older, far deeper, a frequency encoded into the soul of the earth. Isis was not created by myth, she was remembered through it, and like all great truths, her story was slowly fragmented, filtered, renamed, and repurposed until only pieces remained. You know her already. You've seen her face in the quiet strength of women who never give up. You've felt her presence in moments of deep loss, when the world cracked open and something sacred came through the grief. Isis is not a goddess of superficial worship. She is the energy that teaches how to hold what's broken, how to walk through death, and resurrect something that was never supposed to live again. But that version of Isis was buried, first in conquest, then in translation, then in time. Today, she lives in symbols misunderstood, in temples desecrated, in stories that were reduced to mythology, stripped of their initiatory power. But if you listen, really listen, you can still hear her. Her story didn't disappear, it went underground. And now, in a time of global unraveling, her voice is rising again. The name Isis is the Greek rendering of the Egyptian Ausit, meaning throne or seat. But names never just describe, they encode. And the throne she represents is not one of power over others, but power over illusion, over fragmentation, over the chaos that comes when the masculine forgets how to feel and the feminine forgets how to speak. She was not just a wife, not just a sister. She was the principle of memory itself, the living current that refuses to forget the soul's wholeness, even when the world falls apart. This is not a story of royalty. It is a story of resurrection. In the sacred mythos of Kemet, what the world now calls ancient Egypt, Isis was the wife of Osiris, a divine king who ruled with compassion and balance. But when Osiris was betrayed and murdered by his brother Set, his body was cut into pieces and scattered across the land. The world descended into shadow. And here begins Isis's true story, not as a goddess enthroned, but as a woman searching through sorrow. Piece by piece, she gathered her beloved's broken body, traveling through realms of death, shadow, and memory, not with rage, but with reverence, not with magic tricks, but with the ancient art of remembering what others let die. She reassembled what was shattered. She wept over his bones. She breathed her spirit into what no longer breathed, and she conceived a son from death. Horus, the falcon, the avenger, the rebirth of divine order through love. But this is not just a myth of devotion. It is a code, a map, a revelation of what the feminine truly is, not passive, not obedient, but transformational. The feminine is what remembers in a world that forgets. It is what holds life and death in the same hand and says, I will not let the sacred be erased. Isis is not a relic of a dead religion. She is a living archetype. And as the world fractures again, as the masculine systems falter and the soul cries for coherence, Isis returns, not in temples, but in you. You've seen her temples, columns rising like lotus stems, walls carved with wings and stars, Philae, Dendera, Abydos. To the ordinary traveler, these are ruins, tourist sites. But to the initiated, these were portals, not built to worship a goddess, but to awaken her within. Because Isis was not a statue, she was a state of being. And her temples were not designed to impress the eyes, they were crafted to alter consciousness. Every chamber, every glyph, every sequence of light and shadow in those ancient halls was aligned with sacred geometry, planetary motion, and the subtle architecture of the soul. You didn't visit the temple of Isis to pray. You went there to remember who you were before the forgetting. The initiates who walked those stone paths were not tourists. They were travelers between worlds. In silence, they fasted, they wept, they dreamt. And in that silence, the frequency of Isis would begin to rise, not as a vision, but as a transmutation. To invoke Isis was not to call something outside yourself. It was to reclaim a part of your own soul that had been exiled by culture, by conditioning, by time. And she responded, always. Because Isis is not passive. She's not a goddess you beg. She is the remembrance force itself, the current that activates when you begin to call your power home, no matter how shattered it feels. She was the patroness of the mystery schools, the keeper of sacred breath, sacred birth, sacred death. The rituals held in her name were not superstition. They were technologies of the soul, designed to dissolve illusion and prepare the initiate for a death that was not physical but psychological, a shedding of false identity, a rebirth into truth. They called her the Great of Magic, but magic here meant alignment, not trick. It meant knowing how energy moved through sound, form, word, and will. Isis was the master of Heka, the Egyptian word for activated intention, language as a vessel for divine vibration. Her priests and priestesses were not bound by dogma. They were trained to see with the inner eye, to hear the voice beneath the noise, to balance the seen with the unseen, the masculine with the feminine, the form with the field. And it was through Isis that these teachings flowed, not as doctrine, but as living memory. But this memory was too powerful for empire. Because if a person remembers that the divine feminine lives within them, they stop bowing to the structures that shame her. They stop obeying systems that call her chaos. They stop pretending their intuition is weakness. And so the temples fell, the names were changed, the myths were distorted, Isis became legend, then symbol, then shadow. And yet her current never died. Because it doesn't live in stone, it lives in you. When you reclaim your intuitive knowing, when you piece together the broken parts of your own story, when you dare to hold grief and creation in the same breath, you are invoking Isis, not in ritual, but in resonance. They say Isis disappeared, that her temples fell, her rituals faded, her name was swallowed by time. But disappearance is never the full story. Sometimes the sacred retreats, not to vanish, but to preserve itself. As empire rose, the old ways became dangerous, not because they were primitive, but because they were too powerful. The feminine current Isis carried did not bow, it didn't conform, it created, it remembered. And in a world increasingly ruled by conquest and control, that kind of memory became a threat. So her images were shattered, her priestesses scattered, her magic labeled heresy, but like all great forces, she didn't die, she migrated. Isis became legend, then symbol, then shadow. But her current, her essence, moved through the hidden cracks of culture, language, and archetype. It whispered through poetry. It encoded itself in Marian iconography. It pulsed through the Gnostic Sophia, through the Black Madonna, through the countless unnamed women who carried mystery in silence. And even when her name was taken by forces that sought to distort and weaponize it, that essence remained untouched, because Isis does not live in letters. She lives in frequency. You see, the memory of Isis has always been held not just in temples, but in the body, in the blood memory of those who descend from lineages that honored her, in the dreams of those who never studied her, but feel her anyway, in the silent strength of those who've lost something sacred and still found the will to rebuild. Isis is the part of you that knows how to resurrect what was never meant to survive. She is the whisper that tells you grief is not the end, that wholeness is not perfection, that what's been broken can be made holy, not in spite of its fracture, but because of it. And in this way, her presence has outlived every empire that tried to erase her. The medieval mystics felt her without knowing her name. Alchemists encoded her in the symbolism of the sacred feminine, the moon, the rose. Renaissance painters painted her as Mary, cradling the divine child, not just in arms but in frequency. And in the modern world, though distorted by commercialism, her image has returned again and again, on walls, in dreams, through synchronicities that defy logic. You don't need to be Egyptian to feel her. You don't need to believe in myth to know her. If you've ever gathered the pieces of your life after loss, if you've ever felt your intuition awaken without permission, if you've ever created beauty in the midst of sorrow, then you've already walked with her. The story is simple on the surface. Osiris, the divine king, is murdered by his jealous brother Set, cut into pieces and scattered across the land. Isis, his wife and sister, searches tirelessly for the fragments of his body, gathering them one by one until she reassembles him. With her magic, her breath, her will, she conceives Horus, the child born from death, the restoration of divine order. But this is not a story of loss and revenge. It is the blueprint of resurrection, the original code of conscious rebirth. And Isis is the one who carries it, not just as a mother or a lover, but as a force of remembering so powerful that even death obeys her. Osiris was more than a god. He was the principle of form, order, coherence. When he was dismembered, it symbolized what happens when spiritual structure is severed, when the sacred is fragmented by ego, power, separation. The world falls into chaos. The masculine forgets its purpose, the soul forgets its source. And so Isis begins her journey, not in glory, not in command, but in grief. Her power is not lightning and wrath, it is presence, persistence. She doesn't flee from what's been destroyed, she walks into it. She bends down and touches the bone. She mourns, not as weakness, but as alchemy, and with every fragment she finds, she sings life back into it. She remembers him, not just as he was, but as he is meant to become. This is the hidden teaching, that resurrection is not instant. It is a process of retrieval, a sacred patience, a gathering of what was lost, not to restore the old, but to create the new. When Isis conceives Horus, she is not bringing Osiris back as he was, she is birthing a higher octave of what he represented, a next evolution, a synthesis of love and loss, order and chaos, death and life. And this is where her myth becomes more than a myth, because each of us carries within us a dismembered Osiris, parts of ourselves exiled by trauma, forgotten by time, shamed by culture. And each of us carries within us the potential to awaken the Isis, the part that refuses to let the sacred die, even when it looks broken beyond repair. She teaches that rebirth is not about returning to who you were, it's about remembering who you were always meant to be. That true magic is not control, it is coherence. And that even when life falls apart, you can choose to gather yourself, breath by breath, choice by choice, until something divine takes shape through you. Isis doesn't give you escape, she gives you the path of return. Not to the past, but to power. The ancients didn't decorate their temples, they encoded them. Every carving, every glyph, every curve etched into the walls was a message, a vibrational signature. And when it comes to Isis, her symbols are not art, they are memory devices, interfaces between the visible and the invisible. Her crown, her wings, her ankh, her throne, each one speaks not to the eyes, but to the soul's inner knowing. Start with her most recognizable symbol, the throne upon her head. This is not a metaphor for rule, it is the symbol of containment, the sacred seat. Isis is the throne not because she governs, but because she becomes the foundation upon which divine order sits. She is not above the gods, she is what allows them to be expressed. Her energy is the base that supports consciousness. Without the throne, the king cannot rise. Without the feminine, the divine has no vessel. Then there are her wings, always outstretched, encompassing, sheltering. The wings of Isis are not for flight, but for protection and integration. They encircle the broken, they wrap around the grieving. They restore coherence to what was torn apart. In alchemical terms, wings symbolize sublimation, the lifting of dense matter into light. And that is what Isis does. She transforms grief into power, memory. In her hand, she often holds the ankh, the cross with a looped top. It is the symbol of life, yes, but more precisely, eternal life. The ankh is the synthesis of opposites, masculine and feminine, heaven and earth, horizontal and vertical. The loop is the womb, the cross is the form. Together they say, life is not linear, it is cyclical, and the feminine holds the key. Isis is also associated with the sistrum, a sacred rattle used in ritual. But this too is more than sound, it is vibrational cleansing. The sistrum shakes loose the stagnant energy, awakens the subtle body, and tunes the soul back to its original frequency. Sound was sacred to Isis, not for entertainment, but as initiation. And then, There is her name, not just a label, but a mantra. To speak the name Isis in its ancient form, Auset, is to activate a pattern, a frequency that aligns the throat, the womb, the memory field of the soul. Her name was once sung in rituals, not to call her from elsewhere, but to awaken her within. Each symbol, each sound, each gesture was part of a living technology. The ancients understood that matter is only half the story. The other half is vibration, and Isis is the weaver of both. She brings form and field into alignment, and in doing so, she brings the soul home to itself. Modern culture has reduced these symbols to aesthetics, jewelry, tattoos, logos, but the energy hasn't changed. What's changed is our awareness, and the moment you stop looking at these symbols as pretty relics and start feeling them as living codes, something awakens, something shifts. Because the symbols of Isis aren't watching you. They're waiting for you, waiting for the moment when you stop reading them and start resonating with them. You can feel it, even if you don't have words for it. Even if you've never studied ancient Egypt, never heard the name Osset, never stepped into a temple or read a line of esoteric text, you feel it. The trembling, the turning, the ache beneath the surface of the world that says, something sacred is coming back. That ache, that's Isis. Not as a figure in history, but as a current in consciousness. A pulse that once moved through rituals and temples is now moving through broken systems, cracked hearts, collapsing paradigms. It doesn't come as thunder, it comes as stillness that will not be silenced. We were told the feminine was soft, passive, receptive, but the true feminine, the Isis current, is electric, elemental. She holds silence, yes, but only so truth can echo louder. She holds grief, yes, but only because it is the portal to birth. She holds the broken, but not to mourn it, to transform it. And now she is moving again, through movements that refuse to be defined by patriarchy, through healers, artists, creators, mystics, people of every gender who are reclaiming the inner voice that was shut down for too long. Isis doesn't return through religion, she returns through remembrance. Every time you trust your intuition in a world that calls it irrational, she rises. Every time you honor your sensitivity as a strength, not a flaw, she breathes through you. Every time you create something from pain, not in spite of it, but because of it, you become her temple. The Isis current is not gendered. It is archetypal. It lives in men, women, non-binary beings, anyone who carries the seed of the sacred and is willing to feel the world fully, to gather the lost, to reassemble what empire has dismembered. That is the return of the feminine, not as ideology but as frequency. And it's not quiet anymore. You can hear it in the collapse of institutions that no longer honor life. You can see it in the waves of people leaving roles, careers, relationships that no longer align. You can sense it in the rising hunger for authenticity, for ancient wisdom, for a spirituality that doesn't shame but reminds. This is not chaos, this is rebirth. And Isis has always known the rhythm of death and resurrection. That's why she never feared the darkness. That's why she went into the tombs, into the underworld, into the silence, not to die there, but to retrieve the pieces. You are living in the moment her myth was pointing to. Not a return to the past, but a rebirth through the present. And in this, her story becomes prophecy. There are no temples you must enter, no priestess robe you need to wear, no ancient incantation you must perfect. To work with Isis, you need only one thing, a willingness to remember. The Isis current is a living intelligence, a vibrational field that responds not to ritual performance, but to inner coherence. She lives in the space between breath and presence, between memory and vision. And when you begin to align your inner world with the same qualities she holds, devotion, depth, creation through grief, she meets you. You can feel her presence when you sit in stillness and finally allow yourself to feel the grief you've been carrying. Not to fix it, but to honor it. You can feel her when you speak truth that trembles on your tongue, not for validation, but because it must be spoken. You can feel her in the creative act born of brokenness, in the softness that holds power, in the fierce protection of the sacred in a world that tries to desecrate it. To work with Isis is to become your own initiator. You begin by listening, not just with your ears, but with your body. What are you avoiding? What part of you has been exiled, fragmented, forgotten? These are the dismembered pieces of your own Osiris. Isis rises in you when you commit, not to perfection, but to recollection. Piece by piece, breath by breath, you gather yourself, and you don't do it alone. The Isis current moves when you set the intention to become whole, when you stop fighting your shadow and start integrating it, when you realize that divinity is not found in escape, but in deep presence with what is. You can invoke her through sound, through her name, not spoken from your throat, but from your soul, through music, chant, sacred breath. You can invoke her through sacred space, not external altars, but the space you carve in your own energy field where silence becomes holy. You can work with her symbolically, placing an ankh, a feather, a wing, or her image in your space. But these are not decorations, they are resonance tools. They tune you to a deeper remembering. They act as mirrors, reflecting a frequency that is already in you. Above all, working with Isis means walking with devotion. Not blind loyalty, but the kind of devotion that says, I will not abandon what is sacred in me, even when it hurts. I will not pretend that love is weak. I will not forget the ancient mother who walks beside me, not to lead, not to follow, but to witness my becoming. She does not want disciples, she wants partners in awakening. And when you begin to walk that path, not above the earth, but inside it, you activate the throne within. The seat of your sovereignty, the memory that says, you are not lost, you are simply remembering who you were before the world told you to forget. If you've come this far, it's not because you were curious about ancient Egypt. It's because something in you already knew. You've walked this path before, in this life or another. The tears, the devotion, the silence, the rebuilding. It's all familiar, not as information, but as a deeper echo, and that echo is Isis. She's not just a goddess, she's not just a myth or an archetype. She is a living pattern, a code that runs through the structure of healing, of memory, of rebirth. She is the fractal of the sacred feminine itself, the force that doesn't ascend out of life, but descends into it, that doesn't bypass pain, but metabolizes it into wisdom, that doesn't ask for worship, but for embodiment. The Isis pattern begins when something sacred breaks. It continues when you refuse to turn away, when you gather the pieces one by one, not because you know what they'll become, but because you know they matter. It deepens when you breathe into the wreckage, when you feel instead of fleeing, and then something miraculous happens. From the brokenness, a new shape forms. Not a replica of what was, but a new life that holds the memory of death. This is resurrection, not as miracle, but as pattern. This is the secret Isis carried across millennia, behind veils, through symbols, through silence. That wholeness isn't about going back. It's about going deeper. That power isn't domination, it's coherence. That creation doesn't come from control, but from the womb of unknowing. And this pattern isn't ancient, it's active. Every time you reclaim your story, Isis lives again. Every time you listen to your inner knowing, even when the world tells you to ignore it, she rises. Every time you walk with grief as an ally, not a curse, you become her voice. Her myth survives because her essence is timeless. And her essence is here now. In a world that is once again unraveling, the Isis pattern is awakening, not through temples, but through those who remember that love is not passive. It is a creative force, a force that rebuilds the sacred not in stone, but in consciousness, in word, in womb, in will. This is the full story of Isis, not a goddess, a guide, not a legend, a code, not someone to follow, but someone to become. Because in the end, Isis is not what you remember. She is who remembers you. If something in this story whispered to you, if you felt not just curiosity, but remembrance, then don't let it fade in silence. Let it echo, like this video, if a part of you stirred. Softly, powerfully, undeniably. Comment below, I am remembering the pieces. Let her know you've heard the call. Share this with someone whose soul is ready to reclaim what was never truly lost. Subscribe for more transmissions from Forgotten Wisdom, and turn on the bell so you don't miss what comes next. Because Isis doesn't return through temples, she returns through us.